Alright, I've loaded in 4 of the objects from the castle, and actually these objects are a little bit different than the ones we modeled. I added a few things to them, just to give them a little more detail, and these are the ones we're going to be using to piece together the castle, plus the keep and the gatehouse, but we don't need to have those in here for right now for texturing, because those textures we can just copy and paste from these models, and these models are going to have the major textures on them, which are more unique than for the other ones. Um, the wall that we have, the texture we're going to have for the main wall right here, we can apply to the tower and to the wall right here, and also to the keep and to the gatehouse. And as far as the round tower goes, this will be a separate texture for this round tower, and then onto the other smaller round towers, if there are any, or the ones the model we're using for the gatehouse actually has round towers on it, and we can use the same texture on that and just copy and paste it. Alright, I'm going ahead and get started. And what we have in the image editor, I've already gone ahead and loaded in all of the textures that we're going to be using, which are available in the content directory on the DVD. And I'm going to open up the objects panel and go ahead and go to render and object dissolve 100% on the objects that we're not using right now, and that's just so we can get them out of the way while we're rendering. I'm going to rotate the light a little using Y on the keyboard. Okay, and now I'll pull up the surface editor, which you can hit F5 or go up here and select wall concentric. And now because these are different objects, these surface names are going to be a little bit different than what we had before, but basically the same. Pull that in. Alright, now if we select the wall, and that's this main texture right here, which covers actually the Merlins all the way down except this strip, the allure, and these little accents that we have right here. I'm going to change the color, and I actually have RGB values I want for this. And they are 86, 84, and 73. And that'll give us a greenish gray, dingy sort of texture. Because our texture is going to be not just built and rather old one. That's the look we're going for. And we're going to click the T next to color for the texture. And the first thing we're going to add is go to image, make sure that the layer type is an image map. And the image we want to add is random textures 2, 10, bump. Because we don't want the color of the actual texture, because it's it's a sort of a rust colored texture, rust brick, red brick, and we want kind of a grayish. And we're going to change the blending mode, and if you look right here, this is what it looks like right now, but if we change the blending mode to multiply, you can see now we have that mixed with that kind of greenish texture we have, that green color. And we're going to change the projection to cubic. I don't know if you noticed there, but if we move the camera in, you can see it as a planar map, it's projecting on only surfaces facing the z-axis. And if we change it to cubic, then it projects down on the y, the z, and the x. Okay, now we're going to change the scale of this and make the bricks just a little bit larger. So we're going to type in 1.2, and that'll give us 1.2 meters on all axes, and make it just a little bit bigger. Okay, and I'm actually going to do a quick render of this right now, just to show you what it looks like. And we're not not centered here. So I'm going to move the camera. I'm also going to turn on anti-aliasing by going to the camera pan. By selecting camera down here, or Shift-C, and then push P on the keyboard to pull up the panel. And under anti-aliasing, classic low. We're going to render that and see how it looks. And overall it looks pretty good, except if you notice there's a little bit of tiling in the texture, where you can tell it's repeating itself. And we're going to take care of that by adding another texture on top of that. And we're going to add a procedural, which is going to add kind of a dirt and grime. And right now we're just going to leave this and minimize it so that we can keep this saved and we can compare. And go back into the color texture and add a layer, procedural. I'm going to change the texture color to black and change that to multiply as well. Bring down the opacity to about 56. And then frequencies 6, contrast 3%, and then 0.818. And we're also going to change the scale of the texture to 2 meters by 2 meters all the way down. And we'll render that and see how that looks. And as you can see, we've added these dark spots in here. And overall, the full texture is a little bit darker, except in small spots like this, which still have the original texture. But it adds a lot dingier look to it. And this is only a small piece of the wall. And once it starts coming together and we add pieces against pieces, you'll see this a lot more as it flex along. It's pretty randomized. So we're going to use the texture. And the next thing we're going to do is change the diffuse map. And we want to select random texture 9 bump. And this is a different type of image. It's just a simple square blocks. And we're going to use this just as a diffuse map to kind of add a little more variation. I'm going to change the blending mode to additive, so it's not completely blocking out the texture, because back at normal it's way too dark. And we're going to change it to cubic. And then the size on this is going to be 1.1, 0.7, 0.7. So 1.1 millimeters, 700 millimeters, 700 millimeters. And the reason we have the X stretched out a little more is because Lightwave is taking a rectangle texture and squishing it into a square. So we just have to pull it out just a little bit more. And that's not going to be a big problem as far as pixelation goes because it is a rather large texture. So we've got a lot to work with. And that's what we're going to use for the diffuse map. And now the next thing we're going to edit is the bump map. And what we can do for that is actually copy from the other layers. So copy selected layer in the color map, go to bump, paste, replace selected layer, and we'll just use that right now. And then in diffuse, we'll do the same thing, copy selected layer, and then in bump, paste, add 2 layers, and that way it doesn't replace what we just put in there. And the only thing we have to change in here now is because now we're working with a bump map, so we need to define how far it jets out. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the amplitude to 5 for both of them. And changing those to normal and see how that looks. And do a quick render. And if you take a look, it looks pretty good. You can see we have this, of course, see the other texture that we have in here, just the square blocks, and that adds a little more to it, and you can barely see the tiling anymore. And it's nice and dark and dingy. And that's pretty much it for the wall texture. And that's also the texture we can use on every single part of the castle almost. Any part where there's sort of square blocks or flat surfaces that are only in one direction, we can use that texture. The next thing we're going to work on is just this strip right here. And for that, we can just copy the wall texture, paste it on the strips, and then just go to the color and lighten it up a bit. And now if we render that, you can see it's still a brick, but it's a little bit lighter and adds a little more variation to it. And that's just what we're looking for. It's not something so different, and not something a different material either. Okay, now we're going to work on the allure, the top walk. And for that, we're not going to use a color map for this, but we are going to define an RGB color for it. And what we have is 145 by 132 by 108. And that'll give us kind of a brown texture, a brown color. And we're going to use a diffuse map to actually make the texture. And we're going to select the image map is going to be random text to 12 bump. And this is just another square texture, but it has a little more kind of grit in it. And we're going to change this to cubic. And the allures are only on top, so actually we could do this planar Y, but I'm just going to do cubic because just in case a little later if we change something, then it's already set up. And the size of this, I don't know if you can tell, I'm going to switch the perspective view. Move these panels out of the way. You can see it's actually quite large. So we're going to move that down, or scale it down to 0.1. And now you can see in here a lot smaller, and it's actually in proportion now. And we're going to use multiply, so it's not so dark. You can see the difference right here. And I guess it really depends on your lighting situation. We're just using one distant light, but if you had several lights and good enough lighting, or if you're using HDR image mapping, then you could use normal and it might look okay. Alright, and then we're going to copy this, copy all layers, and open up the bump, and paste replace to all layers, and change the texture amplitude to 3, and the blending mode to normal. And that way we have the exact same texture as the bump. I'm going to go ahead and render that really quick to see how that looks. And you can see the allure right here, and it looks pretty good. It's nice and defined. And we have a nice close-up of the brick here too, and you can see it's very well defined as far as the bump map goes. And that's actually what we're looking for, is so when we do have close-ups, it does look real, and it will have a little more grit to it. Of course, it won't be this flat in real life, maybe not so smooth, but there's only so much you can do with texturing. And as far as the modeling of that, if you were to make individual blocks, it would take a very long time and a very long time to render, and it also might be way too many polygons for Lightwave to handle. Alright, the next thing we're going to do is just change these little accents right here by copying the allure and pasting it on that. And what we're going to do is just make it a little bit lighter. And that way we get a nice brick texture on it, but it's a little bit lighter than the allure, so it separates it. And then we can use the same texture on these right here. So we'll just copy and we'll paste it onto the sides. And we'll do a quick render and see how that looks. And that looks pretty good. We could actually, if we wanted, we could scale down this texture just a little. So it's not creating these large gaps on the sides. But right now we're just going to leave that because it actually looks pretty good. And the texturing is now complete for the concentric wall. So what we're going to do is open up the Objects panel and give this a dissolve of 100 and go to the tower and dissolve it down to 0 and start working on the texture for the tower here. And pull up a surface editor. And what we can actually do is take the allure, the top walk, and just paste it onto the top walk of the tower, because we're just going to use the same texture and the same pattern design. And for the wall, copy and paste that onto the tower. But what's going to happen now is because we're using cubic mapping, we're going to get a strange looking effect on the corners, or where each axis meets up with each other. So where the X and the Z bump up. So the way to change that is by using cylindrical mapping instead of cubic. So what we're going to do is open up the texture here for color, and we're going to change that to cylindrical on the Y. And right now it's stretching out the whole texture around the entire object, so what we need to do is tell it how many times it should wrap around. And we're going to use 10, so now there's 10 copies of it going all the way around, and that should be good. And now we can go through and just change each one to cylindrical on the Y with 10 width wraparound amount. And that's taken care of that problem we had before. There is a little bit of distortion here, but that's just from Lightwave, from layout, displaying it improperly. And the next thing we're going to do is we have that forced black layer in there, and we're just going to go ahead and change that to black and put the diffuse down to 0, and that way it won't pick up any light. And you can see that in there. Undo. And now we can take the tower texture, copy it, and paste it onto the Merlins. And there is being stretched in here a little, but because we are using bricks that are pretty small, that's not going to show up too much, and it's going to actually look alright when we render it. And now we have to change this top strip right here and to make sure that's the right texture, and it is. So what we're going to do is take the tower and copy and paste it onto tower top. But as you can see, there's a lot of distortion, and that's because of the axis. And what we need to do for this is actually use a spherical map. And we're going to change the height wraparound, actually probably to about 20. And now, as you can see, it goes along with the curve on that axis. Cylindrical mapping will not work for something like this. And actually, if we were to use spherical mapping on the allure, now if these blocks weren't perfectly square, we could actually have them circling about if we use spherical mapping. And that's pretty much what we did right here. And we might even need to go in and change the surface name of this right here and change that, but that seems like it's actually going to be okay. Alright, now we're going to edit this strip around, but before we do that, actually the tower needs to be smoothed, and we can leave the merlins. Actually, we'll leave the merlins the way they are, because there's really no smoothing that needs to be done on those. And that top part, actually we'll turn off smoothing on that top part. And we'll figure out which the ring is. Alright, and now we're going to edit this ring. And for that we're just going to use the tower texture, paste it on there, make it a little bit lighter. Alright, and now we're going to change this little nurney right there. So what we can use is actually going to use the allure for that. And we're going to actually darken that a little. And I like using a lot of the same textures because that way the coloration is pretty much the same. And for this we actually do need to change it a little because we're getting kind of a weird looking effect there, and that's because of the cylindrical mapping. So we're going to change that to, actually that's because of the cubic mapping. Let's see how it looks with cylindrical. And we might need to wrap it around a few times. 50 should be good. And it's a little different throughout, but it looks pretty good. And we can even use the same texture on the corbels. Except we want the corbels to be nice and dark. And we're just going to render that real quick and take a look. Okay, that's finished. And it looks really good. Now if we turn ray tracing shadows on, we'll be able to see the shadows in here, and it'll look a little bit better. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and do that and see how that looks. And actually, to get to this menu right here, what I'm doing is I'm holding down Control and Shift, right mouse clicking, and then you can go to Render Options, and then Ray Trace Shadows, and we'll render that again. Okay, we have our shadows in here now. And mostly the way the light's facing, you can see them mostly up here. And actually, my only beef with Lightwave is that when you're using distant lighting, you get these harsh shadows, and you pretty much always get harsh shadows in Lightwave. And in real life, shadows from light aren't always this crisp, and they usually change. For distance, they would be sharp right here and a little blurry on top. And there's really not much you can do about that. There are a few plugins out there, Shadow Designer, and things of that nature to create that kind of blurry look along the edges. But we're going to work with what we have right now, and it seems to be okay. So now the texture for the tower is done. We still have to do the door down here. And actually for the door, it's pretty simple. We're just going to copy something over. Actually, we're going to use what we used for the allure along the door ring. And it's not quite perfect because it's not going around, we could UV map that and it would look okay. But it's a little more work than what we need because we're just going to be kind of far away from it. And for the door, we're going to actually use the wood panels that we have. Right there. And I actually want to make them going up and down. Oh, just the bank. And we're going to scale them down to half of what they are. Actually, those are pretty big. So maybe 0.4. Actually, I'm going to remove that texture from the color and put it on the diffuse. And then change the color to kind of a brownish looking color. And change that to multiply. And maybe we'll make it a little bit lighter. And we're going to do the same thing with the bumps. We're just going to copy all layers and paste replace all layers. And the texture amplitude is going to be, I'd give it a 3. And that should look alright. And now the modeling for the tower is complete. So we're going to open up the object properties and dissolve it to 100%. And now the curtain wall is the next thing we're going to be working on. And we'll set that to 0%. And bring this into view. And as you can see, I've gone ahead and added some separators along the top here. And that's just so we don't have long continuous boards going all the way across. Or actually this way. Alright. And we can just copy the wall from the other wall, place in, and from the tower around we can take the corbels and copy the corbels onto that. And the allure, we can just use the same top walk, which you can't really see right now, but if you got inside you would be able to see that. And for this top part right here, we want to have brick as well. So we're actually going to use just the regular wall. And let's see here. Can't really see these surface names. Top wall right along here. And we're going to make that a little lighter, so it doesn't look exactly like this. I'm going to go ahead and render that real quick and I'll show you how that looks. Okay, and as you can see we still have our brick. And it's still nice and dirty. But it's a little bit lighter than this, so it offsets it just a little. And we still want this to be made of brick, so it looks good that way. And now we're going to add the wood texture to this top part up here. And what we're going to do for this is the roof. And just open up the diffuse, because we want to define our own color. And we're going to grab that 67 bump planar on the Y. Change the rotation, banking it. Oh, actually, we're going to do a heading. 90 degrees, and that's because we want the panels, the boards going this way instead of the other way. And we're going to have to scale that down. And take a look and see how that looks. And maybe just a tad bit bigger. Maybe 0.55. And now it looks a little weird because we have the light panel, or the light boards, pretty much equal throughout. And it can look a little strange like that. And we'll take care of that with the color map, and by adding another procedural to kind of dirty it up a bit. But first we're going to use add the bump map by copying all layers and pasting onto the bump texture and doing a texture amplitude of 4. And we'll change the color really quick to kind of a dark brown. And actually this diffuse we'll do as multiply. Or actually we'll change that to additive right now because we are going to be adding the color map on here. And change the layer type to procedural and change it to black. We're going to change our opacity down to 56 as we have before. Actually, maybe 63. Give that a try. 6.3 and then 0.818. So it's same consistency as the wall. But what we're also going to do is we're going to change the position on that so so the dirt doesn't equal up entirely with that. And as you can see right here, it's nice and dirtied up. And we're going to change the size to 2. And then we're going to grab the allure and paste it onto that roof strip to give it a different texture on there. And that actually lined up just about perfect. And we'll give that a quick render and see how that looks. And as you can see, it looks pretty good. We've got that nice dirty looking effect now. And actually we can increase that a little so it looks a little bit dirtier. And this strip we're going to darken so it offsets just a little. And change that procedural on the roof to, let's say, 78. And then I'll make it a little bit darker. And render that and see how that looks. And there we have it. Now the curtain wall is complete. And we have a nice texture up on top here for all the wood. And we might need to change the color on this a little. It is a little white. But we can go and change that just by going to the top wall and changing that. Alright, and now the last thing we have to do is to change the tower. And I'm going to go ahead and just restore everything. So we can see all the objects. And the last thing we have right here is our tower. And for this, all we have to do is copy and paste from other textures because it's so similar that we don't have to do any specific changes. And we can copy the wall. And that looks good. And that ring, we will take our strip right there. And we can copy over our connectors. And then the support, which is actually the corbels, we're going to take off the round tower. And the allure is the only thing that's left. We'll take the top walk. And there we have it. Now this tower is also textured. And the only thing left actually is this forced black, if you can see that in there. So just take the forced black, change it down to RGB value of 0 on all, and change the diffuse down to 0, and now it's black on the inside. And there we have it. All our main pieces are textured. And if you want to texture any of the other models, all you have to do is just copy and paste the correct textures onto the right ones. If you have any smaller towers, you could just use the same textures. Any other round towers, you can use the same textures. The keep and the gatehouse are going to have the same textures as the wall right here, depending on whether you have square towers for the gatehouse or round towers for the gatehouse, depending on which one you copy it from. And that's pretty much it for the textures. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick render of all of these, so you can kind of see how they look. And then we'll be done. Okay, as you can see here, now the tower is a lot easier, a lot bigger, so you can actually see that dirt and the grime a little bit better. You can also change the color of that. You can make it kind of mossy if you wanted. You could add that, make that green instead of black, and kind of a darkish green. And same thing with the roof on top of here, if you wanted to have kind of a moldy decay on it. But other than that, all the textures are completed. And now we're going to go ahead and assemble the castle.